All right, welcome everyone to our discussion this morning on COVID-19 in Ukraine, outlook for the pandemic's impact on Ukraine's economy, politics, and society. It's clearly no exaggeration to say that this is a global crisis. It is perhaps comparable to world wars in the scope of its impact on so many in so many respects for the challenges that we now face globally in terms of governance, in terms of security, in terms of social cohesion, in terms of economic development. Ukraine, of course, has faced existential challenges over the past decade, arguably even longer than that. Its war with Russia, the occupied territories in Donbass and Crimea, the effort to rebuild governance, to restore economic growth in the country after the depredations of the last many years. So this is a country that is not unfamiliar with challenges, and yet this, a public health crisis, is a test of a kind that perhaps even the government and society forged in crisis were not prepared to deal with. And yet we have an excellent window into what's going on in Ukraine, and we're very fortunate to be joined this morning by four outstanding experts who are coming to us with recent experience on the ground in the region, though, of course, like all of us, they are doing their part to keep this pandemic from spreading by staying at home. So we're all coming to you live by the grace of the Wilson Center IT team and comms team and Zoom, and we all pray that this platform will continue to work for us. Let me just say, this is, of course, one of dozens of events we've already managed to do in this new post-social distancing phase. We're very grateful to our Wilson Center colleagues who've made it possible. We have been able to cover everything from the state of the global economy to various dimensions of the regional response to COVID-19 crisis, as well as the issues that may be missed, that have been shunted off to the back burner, like, for example, security in the Arctic region, which we covered in a live event last week. So I'm very pleased to have everybody with us today. What I'm going to do is go right to our four speakers. I'm going to introduce them one at a time so that their brief, totally brief and inadequate biographical background will be fresh in your mind before they speak. Then I'll introduce the next speaker. Each one will go for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A discussion. And I will receive the questions from our team here electronically. So you just go ahead and submit them online through the chat feature. And I will see them within at most a couple of minutes, and I'll be able to read them out and make sure to get as many questions in as possible. So I want to go first to Ilana Stologu, who will speak to us about just briefly about the overall situation with COVID-19 in Ukraine and focus in on the impacts on the Ukrainian economy. She is the CEO of Vox Ukraine. She started working at the Kiev School of Economics in December of 2010 and now holds the position of Director for Policy Research. Before joining the Kiev School of Economics, Ilana worked in the banking sector where she performed market and operational risk analysis. Ilana, please take it away.
Hello, everyone. I'm pleased to greet you. So first, a few quick numbers. So now Ukraine has 900 people tested positively with the virus, and 19 people who get well, and 23 deaths. Currently, this is more than capacity of the Ukrainian healthcare system, because we have about 12,000 prepared beds for the future patients. But the quarantine measures are quite strict in the country. So right now, the government prohibited people from going out without the documents. People can be outside for a limited number of purposes and time, and so on. So quarantine measures are quite strict, and public transport doesn't work and also transportation between regions of Ukraine is closed by public transport. Now I'll move to the economic situation. I will share my screen because I prepared a small presentation on the numbers. Do you see it? Okay. So since this is a black swan event, no estimates are possible, but rough estimates are that this crisis is going to lead to about minus 4% of GDP. Although if the government is not able to secure the IMF program and other types of support, the crisis is going to be much deeper. And I prepared a small SWOT analysis to see just what can be the risks and opportunities. And the strong side of Ukraine is now we have a much stronger banking sector than in 2008, 2009. And we also have a large agricultural sector, and there's going to be quite high demand for agricultural products. Also, low energy prices are helping us, and hopefully the government will launch some infrastructure projects that will reduce unemployment. Threats are war in the east and default, which can happen if only if the government decides that, and this leads us to the weaknesses, which is policy making. Quite a lot of inefficient companies that were inefficient even before the crisis. The flow of labor migrants, of people who work abroad, can increase unemployment. And also, since the healthcare reform touched only the first level, this hospitals can be the real problem. Right now, we don't have reliable data on the impact of crisis on people. We have only the surveys. So we don't have any administrative data from, for example, unemployment service or from the statistical office. And here we see that 7% of people already bear serious losses from the crisis. So the situation is not dangerous, but it can worsen very quickly. And also you can see here that 14% of people report job loss. And if you look at the employed population, this amounts to over 2 million people. Many people stopped going to work, and only a fraction of them, 24% of them, continue to study or work at home. And so many people are not using the internet or some online opportunities, or maybe they just cannot use them. And this is the slide that I would like to emphasize, that you can see here that people over 60, much greater amount are continuing to go to work or to school. This is because they are mostly working in the government sector. Many doctors in particular are of senior age, and this is potentially a dangerous situation for these older age people. Okay, and many people report either reduced income or partially reduced income, and about a third of people say that they will have money only for March. Another third says that they will have money savings only for March and April. Impact of business we also know only from the surveys, and this is, I must emphasize that this is not a representative survey. The previous one was representative, this one is not. These numbers are reported by a business association, which mostly unites small and medium business. So you can see here that many businesses report that they will not be able to work for long under these conditions introduced by the government. And quite a lot of businesses report revenue fall due to the quarantine. This is mostly a services sector. And many, despite that, many of them report that they are not going to fire a lot of workers. So probably business expects that the crisis will be V-shaped, so that as soon as the quarantine is lifted, the business will pretty much return to the usual mode. Okay. And this is a survey of the European Business Association, which is also not representative. This association presents mostly large business and business with foreign investment. And here you can see that these enterprises feel more or less okay, although some of them report that they will reduce salaries or cut their employees. What was the policy response to that? The monetary policy, the National Bank lowered interest rate a bit. We don't see the large rate cut because this may cause higher inflation and devaluation of the currency. Also, the National Bank supported somewhat the hryvnia by spending the reserves, although it allowed it slowly to depreciate. And also suggests some measures for banks to support the real economy, like loan vacations on payment of interest, no delay, no fines for delayed payments, and the government also imposed a freeze on interest rate rise. Fiscal policy response so far has been moderate because we don't have money to introduce a very large policy response because there is no IMF program at the moment. There was some tax relief. There was the procedure for getting unemployment benefits was simplified. And also small business and self-employed people also got some tax relief. And also there were measures specific to healthcare, like a temporary increase of salaries for medical workers, also temporary cancellation of taxes for medical goods and medicines, and for alcohol that is used to make disinfection liquid. And also there was some intention to speed up the registration of drugs and procedures that seem to be effective in fighting coronavirus. This is all for introduction.
Okay, thank you very much, Ilana. I want to clarify, to ask questions, you can tweet them to @Kennan Institute and submit them on Facebook to Kennan Institute, or email them to kennan@wilsoncenter.org. Okay, I want to go next to Victor Andrusev, who's going to talk to us about the overall state of politics around the epidemic and the impact on Ukrainian politics so far. Victor is a well-known figure. He's the executive director of the Ukrainian Institute for the Future. Prior to that, he served as vice governor of the Donetsk region in Ukraine, where he was responsible for the humanitarian sphere, obviously enormously important given the war in that region. And from 2006 to 2014, he was a leader of the political organization Democratic Alliance, one of the organizations behind the Euromaidan. So, Victor, please.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Matt, for the presentation. Okay, just briefly to describe how Ukraine looks for me now. It's I feel myself in 2014 when we don't have enough state authorities. The state has no enough capacity to act. At the same time, society is starting to organize very strong and to solve the problems by themselves. So, okay, let's briefly look at the state of authorities. So the president himself is doing a lot. He tries to communicate a lot of things. He gathered the big business and oligarchs and proposed them to lead the regions, to lead, I mean, not officially, but to create some headquarters of help. And they actually buy a lot of things with their own money from China, and the test system, the hospital equipment, and other things. But at the same time, the office of the president, the last few weeks, is in great scandal. The first part of the scandal is that the head of the office bought a very expensive car. Almost the next day, the president asked the business to help to beat the epidemic. And but the real problem was the publication of the videos where the brother of the head of the office is like bargaining with some positions in government and in ministry. And that was a huge scandal. But for the moment, it looks like it goes down because nobody from persons who were mentioned on that video were not appointed. So also in Sluga Narodu and the president, they consider that behind the scandal is staying the former head of the office, Andrew Bogdan. So they consider him as a person who published that video. So the situation with the government is very bad because we just in March adopted the new prime minister, but still after months we don't have a lot of positions occupied. We still have no Ministry of Energy, Education, and others. But at the same time, we already have 2 new ministers who, because the previous ones served only 3 weeks. And the problem is that actually we changed just the parliament has changed 2 ministries who actually are at the key ministries under the crisis. It's a budget, it's a Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Healthcare. So, and this means that only newly adopted persons, they would need additional time to get involved in the situation and to understand the things right. So they are not able to act quickly. So this also shows how much the government is not capable to react properly and is not prepared. If we look to the parliament, also the big situation happened there this week. We can say now that the coalition from one fraction, so-called mono coalition, dissolved. And the reason for that was the adoption of the laws which IMF demanded. It was a law on land, which was finally adopted, and the law on banks, so-called anti-Kolomoisky law, which should prevent turning back the private bank to Kolomoisky. After these laws were adopted, and they were actually adopted with the help of another fractions, and the Sluga Narodu has not enough votes to adopt it by itself. So actually this is a new point for Zelensky. He lost his coalition in parliament, and it means that he will be in big troubles in next few months. And I think we will have a huge crisis parliamentary by the end of the year. So At the same time, I have just fresh figures on polls which were published yesterday about how population estimate the steps of government. So to say that Zelensky has 56% of support of his actions, that people consider him as effective in this situation. Regarding the prime minister, 44% of people were not able to estimate. So partly because he is new, and partly because actually people don't understand what he has, what he is doing, because he communicate very few. So the big issue for Ukraine now is the question of state of emergency. Because we have quarantine, which was enforced today by the government, but actually there is a big plan of adopting the state of emergency. I'm personally really afraid of this, because this will be a huge damage on economics and on all the other things. So we can fail so much that it will be very difficult then to stand up. And I joke that the virus is not so big threat as a struggle against virus for us. Okay, so to say, but society itself, 49% they support implementation of state of emergency. So it means that people are really considering the situation of virus very strict, and 87% consider virus as a real threat, and 51% consider as a threat for personally for themselves and their family. So just to mention one more thing, that for the moment also our government failed to implement the special law. Ilona mentioned something, that they did not change the fiscal politics. They didn't made the budget cuts, and the law which they passed to do that failed in parliament on Monday. So I think the next week they should present the new law, what they should have to do, and we will see whether the parliament will have enough votes for that. So the final remark I would like to add about the Ukrainian economics. So as far as you know, almost from 40 to 50% of our economy is in shadow. And we have a big problem here with the government politics, because the government consider stimulate and to respond to crisis through reducing the taxes. But in shadow economy, half of business is not paying taxes. So with this politics, business will not be able to come through this crisis. And so they should really look for special monetary politics with the credits and other things to give business a possibility to develop without the concrete direct money from the government. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. I want to turn now to Andrian Prokip, who will talk to us about the impacts on Ukrainian society. Andrian is a senior associate with the Kennan Institute. He is an energy expert as well with the Ukrainian Institute for the Future, a member of the Younger Generation Leaders Network for Euro-Atlantic Security, and was previously a fellow at the Dixie Group, an independent Ukrainian think tank involved in research and consultations in the energy arena. Andrian, please.
Thanks for the introduction, Matt. So talking about Ukrainian society, it's in between two fears. It's a fear of epidemic, it's a fear of getting sick, and that is a fear of economic recession, losing job, losing incomes, and what means actually losing any opportunities to survive in the case if we have a pretty long quarantine. As it was mentioned, most of Ukrainian society consider this COVID-19 as a really threat for both, for the country and for themselves. And in the very beginning, people were skeptical about all these steps that the government took, but now about 83% support the idea of prohibiting any public meetings, any public events. 74% agree that penalties should be introduced for violating the quarantine regime. still 58% suppose that current steps that government took to cope with COVID, that these are good. 28% suppose that these are not enough, and only 6% consider that these measures are too strict. However, on Monday, on April 6th, we will have much more serious restrictions that will be prohibited to get to any parks, forests, because 2 weeks ago there were so many people who organized barbecues in the forest that so people are becoming more and more concerned. So another concern is it's about economic recession and losing incomes. Since beginning of the quarantine on March 11, 35% people say that they still continue working as usual, visiting their offices and working places. 29% moved to telework. 32% are on vacations with payment or at their own expense, and 4% have lost their job. And the biggest problem in the case of Ukraine that people don't have enough much savings to survive too long. So 60% of respondents they said that they have savings to survive only for 1 month in the case if they have no salary. 16% can survive for 2 months. So economic recession and like total quarantine, closing everything is going to be a really serious problem. However, so government expects that the peak of this epidemic will be in the mid of April, and there is also another one threat that we have in the second part of April. We have Orthodox Easter, and there is a tradition. All people gather to churches. They visit their friends and relatives. So there is one more challenge: how people will treat themselves in this period of Easter, and especially this may be a problem in the rural area. And rural area has much worse medicine, healthcare rather than in cities. However, even in cities, people are concerned. So concern is really high, and both about the quality of healthcare and about if people can have enough money to survive during the quarantine.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrian. I want to go now to Mikhailo Minakov, who will talk about government response, but also in comparative context with other regional states. Misha is the senior editor for the Kennan Institute's, senior advisor for the Kennan Institute and editor-in-chief of the Focus Ukraine blog at Kennan. He's also editor-in-chief of the Ideology and Politics Journal, and is a well-known expert focused on political modernization in Eastern Europe, theory and practice of revolution, and political imagination and ideologies. So, Misha, please.
Hello everyone, and good day to good health to everyone who watches us today. So basically, globally, there are 4 generic models of government response to the epidemics: Chinese, East Asian, European, and Scandinavian. And all these models differ. How massive is the testing? How strong the quarantine is imposed? How big damage is done to the economy by these quarantine measures? And how disciplined is society? The post-Soviet countries and post-Soviet governments tend to use the European one. When there's a minimal testing, there's not enough tests, there's always a delay, so government doesn't really understand how big the epidemic is. Then the quarantine is gradually being imposed, so some soft measures that actually do not prevent from the spread, but already making an impact on economy, and then strong quarantine and self-isolation, but at this stage when it's a little bit too late. Also, society responds slowly to the quarantine measures. So societies are not disciplined, like in Eastern Asian case, for example. And then we have this quite a widespread of infection, slow response of government and society. However, if we look at the post-Soviet governments, then we will see three basic types of how this European model is being implemented. First, there's a group of deniers, the most peculiar one, and it's, of course, is based on the authoritarian regimes, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Belarus. Up until today, recently, yesterday, several medical experts in Belarus dared to actually say that there are cases of COVID in Belarus, and there's also one victim already, but it is strongly denied by the ruler of Belarus. In Turkmenistan, the very word of COVID infection is prohibited. And in Tajikistan, who started reacting recently, but they waited until Nowruz to start, this big traditional festivity to start, and a lot of people got probably this contagion at these mass gatherings. There's another group of the so-called fast responders. The first governments to respond in early March were Armenia and Georgia. Recently, also Kyrgyzstan have joined this group. Kyrgyzstan, for example, have already introduced certain measures and agreed with IMF on support of their anti-epidemic measures. Armenia and Georgia will most probably have a very controlled situation in terms of epidemics, so they were quite fast reacting and introducing certain measures, but their economies will probably be damaged by these measures as well. And finally, there is a slow responders, and Ukraine is among those. When Ukraine was waiting a little bit too long in responding to the many stages of the spread of the virus. So infection was coming into Ukraine, mainly was brought by the labor migrants from Europe, and government was very slow in creating certain conditions, measuring temperature, putting those migrants returning to Ukraine on quarantine. So basically from 70,000 to 150,000, there are different estimates of people returned from Poland, from Spain, from Italy into Ukraine within the period of 3-4 weeks. And they were the major source of the infection. And from March 12, there was statistically and epidemiologically established the fact that the source of infection was already in the country. So basically by today, we do not have massive testing, and our epidemic service does not have a clarity of what is going on where, but we know that there are heavy cases of unusual atypical pneumonia. And in recent 2-3 weeks, when the tests were already on the ground, these pneumonias were tested as coronavirus provoked. But we also know that basically Ukraine follows Italian model when polyclinics, medical wards became the centers of the spread of the infection. If we look at today's statistics, there are several tens of medicians who are infected and who are sick, and also many medical servants, brave people, specialists who are fighting the epidemic, but there's also a number of people leaving their medical positions, being afraid of the infection without having specific materials to defend themselves. So basically that's a situation where Ukraine looks like a slow responder, but at least we know how shall it proceed, because we have this Italian and Spanish example, and probably at a certain moment with a new minister of health, what's 2 days, 3 days as he's in office, we would probably change the policy, but it remains yet to see. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all of you for the excellent opening presentations. We have lots of questions that have come in already. So I want to try to get through as many of these as I can. But of course, if you want to continue to ask questions, you can tweet them to @KennanInstitute or post them for Kennan on Facebook or email kennan@wilsoncenter.org. So why don't we begin with this, actually. What, if any, impact is the pandemic having on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine? Victor, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yes, well, I don't think that there will be some development, and we had this problem also, one additional scandal with Andrew Yermak, that in Minsk they were ready to create special consultative council, which should legalize the negotiations with separatists. And the problem was also that he signed this document, approved this document. So, and now he also stepped back. So I think that the Ukrainian-Russia relations and the war on Donbass also will go for quarantine, because Russians themselves have a lot of challenges. They just canceled now the referendum on constitution changes. So I think for the next few months, most of us will be concentrated on our problems. Also, the big problem of oil prices for Russians. But the key question is how we will look after the epidemic. I mean, Ukraine and Russia. How much will we suffer, Ukraine and our economy, and will we be weakened very much or not? And I think that the real change on relations and the real change on situation can have place after the quarantine and after the end of epidemic.
But just to be clear on that point, Victor, you don't see the epidemic itself, the impact that that's having, causing chaos, shutting down parts of the economy. You don't see that changing the dynamics of the war. We are getting into, what might be called campaigning season, right? I mean, you don't expect like a big uptick in fighting because of this opportunity, do you?
No, I don't see that there will be some changes because of the quarantine and because Russians and we are concentrated on the internal problems, which actually caused by the COVID virus. So, but again, how we will look after the end, this is the biggest issue. Will we be stronger or weaker? And I think the Russians will take floor on the results of our politics.
Good. Does anyone else on the panel want to comment on the impacts on the conflict?
I would like to add just a small comment that shelling on the contact line still continues, so there is no sign of Russia weakening its strategy on, keeping the Ukrainian army alert about what's going on.
Okay, and then Misha, I saw your hand as well.
Yes. Well, basically, there's a change in the procedure of moving through the front line. The number of checkpoints is reduced, and there's only the local dwellers who have the right to move on. The quarantine started in both de factos, and it's a strange situation there. Basically, they don't have tests as well, but they somehow operate with certain figures on the non-controlled territories. A certain time ago, several days ago, Russia lifted prohibition for the people from the non-controlled territory to move through the border. So they kind of can go and access medical support on Russian soil. And on Ukrainian side, there was a problem with doing it. So right now, the war for the hearts and minds is a little bit tricky. 3 days ago, there was a first time when the Ukrainian army announced that there was a case of COVID in the army. They did not specify in which part of the army, but probably it was in the Donbass. However, so far the army looks, Ukrainian army looks like being a safe harbor for the infection.
Mm-hmm. I have a good question that's come in here, and I think I can say the source, Tiffany Zhu from Stanford, is asking how Ukraine's new procurement infrastructure, for example, apps like Prozoro, this enhanced transparency system for procurement, is this holding up? Is this relevant in the shift towards more business being done online, and in particular for the healthcare sector like hospitals? I'm curious if you guys have any insight into that. And in particular, I'd like to add to that, what does the situation of scarcity look like in Ukraine? Are you having the kinds of problems that we've seen in other countries, including here in the United States, being unable to get masks, being unable to get certain basic medical supplies, and then, of course, the sort of famous joke, but not a joke, about toilet paper? Who wants to, Ilana, do you want to start on that one, on the economy, and then others can come in?
Yes, first on procurement. Actually, the procedure through Prozoro is quite long. It usually takes a month. So the government recently adopted another regulation that allows to do the procurement for medical things in 2 days. Although they're still fine-tuning that, I don't think I've seen cases of that of that regulation operating right now. As for the general supplies, well, there is a shortage of masks and other things like paracetamol and disinfectant in drugstores. Although, in fact, you can find it, and as you can see on the streets, many people solve this problem either by making masks themselves or by finding masks somewhere. Yet there is still anecdotal evidence that many hospitals lack costumes, masks, and other protective stuff. So yes, there is a problem, and export of that thing is banned right now.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to comment on this? Please.
I just wanted to add that government just allowed people to create their own masks. I mean, to use their own home handmade masks because we really lack a lot of them. But at the same time, I just wanted to mention that people do really a lot themselves, business, not the government, but the society is now organized, the volunteers. Our institute, for example, we created the special application which connects people, help people, and inform people. And so a lot of other also volunteers, and they do a lot of job. And for example, volunteers start to provide army with the masks. So this is also the example that not the state is effective for the moment.
I want to bring in a question from Aaron Kennett, who asks whether you could discuss the differences, in particular, oblasts in the east of the country that may be closer to the war, oblasts in the west of the country and the center. Are there significant differences observable in the level of response, the level of quarantining, et cetera? And I also want to tack on this question from Gwen Sassa, who asks whether the negotiations on Donbass are essentially frozen. That's an update maybe for you, Victor, just quickly, if you could address that, since you talked before about the Yermak scandal possibly freezing the negotiations.
Well, if we talk about the regional dimension, we had also one more interesting fact. When at the beginning of the quarantine and at the beginning of the epidemic, in Kharkiv region, the local oligarch and the mayor of the Kharkiv city, they actually were very rude with the governor. So they just like to ask him to shut up under the round table. And this actually is a very noxious sign, because the governor is a direct person from the president. So the local authorities are doing much more now than the central state. And well, to say that the situation all over Ukraine is very similar, I would say. So of course, they try to solve the problems in different ways, but they are like on the front line more than the government. Yeah.
Okay, and I want to, does anyone else want to comment on the regional variations?
Yes, if I may. So basically, if we look at the spots where the infection is registered, we have like leaders in Kyiv city and also in several cities, oblast level cities in Western Ukraine. And oblasts there are tending to close the borders of the oblasts. For example, Chernivtsi have closed their borders, and they try to respond locally at the oblast and at the community levels to the challenges. However, it's quite difficult in the current situation with the shortage of tests and also this security dresses for the medical staff. Oh, but there's this difference. So far, Western Ukraine has more registered cases of the infected people.
I want to, Misha, while we're on you, I want to stay on you for just a moment and ask an excellent question from Andrei Bozhok, who asks whether this authoritarian tendency, and also I would add the denialism that you described on the part of some of the most authoritarian regimes in neighboring countries, we basically seem to have two competing trend lines. One is that the Ukrainian state collapses, as we've seen happen before, because of all the pressure on the ruling party, on the president himself, on his team. And the other is perhaps that it swings towards more authoritarian tendencies. What can citizens who care about democracy and a functional democratic state, what can they do?
Well, so far it's mainly to cooperate either, as Victor was saying, on this societal level, well, horizontal levels, when people find other different ways of cooperating and also being socially responding and self-isolation. But also there's the community level of response. Government of Ukraine is playing an unfair game right now. The sequester and the change in the budget puts more and more responsibility on local authorities without providing them with additional funding, but also cutting their taxes. The taxes that are being cut so far, they were fitting into the local budgets. So there is this disparity and a growing tension between local authorities, regional administrations, and central government.
Does anybody else want to comment on this question of democracy?
Victor.
So, yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, look, we have also one big issue. It's a question of state of emergency. And on the implementation of the state, for sure, Mr. Avakov could be the head of the whole processes. So we have this big risk, but the risk is not that the state of emergency will be implemented. We are not, the authorities, the power is not able to implement that state of emergency, because if you remember, the Poroshenko, he tried to implement state of war, and he actually, this was ended with a funny context, because nothing, the state was implemented, but nothing changed. But the problem is that if they will try to do that, or you see, the problem is that if you will try to act as a China, but you're not a China, you can fail very deep. And this is the biggest problem, that our authorities, they consider themselves as a China. They would like to do in some Soviet manner control, to block, and other things. Instead, for example, our institute, we propose so-called smart quarantine, when we more rely on people responsibility, because actually this is more closer to the population and the country we are. And so I think that this will be the huge mistake and big fail of Zelensky if they will try to implement the state of emergency under Avakov. But this risk is really high to have this problem. And for sure, this will infect the democracy. And please do not forget that in autumn, we should have the local elections. And this is again a big problem now, because without the state of emergency, they will be not able to transmit them for example, for spring of 2021. And they are not prepared to have that elections. And also Zelensky would like to join these elections together all around Ukraine and on Donbass. And now we understand that there is no any chance to have them in autumn on Donbass.
Just to follow up on the question of elections, even setting aside the possibility of elections in Donbass, which of course has a big security and geopolitical dimension, it seems clear that throughout the region, there will be delayed elections. It will set the precedent that some figures can hold on to power longer than they might otherwise do. That's not necessary at the national level in Ukraine, but would there be an incentive to do that at the local level?
Well, I'm afraid that we will have this parliament crisis, and the problem is that we cannot postpone them because they are in constitution, and the constitution has a direct norm that we should have them at that time. And to make any steps besides the state of emergency is not possible under the law. And taking into account the parliamentary crisis, I think the parliament will be not able to change the constitution or the law. And at the same time, also regarding the democracy issues, we have a huge challenge for the decentralization, because decentralization should be finished before the elections. But now we see that they will be not able to end it before the elections. So again, there will be a lot of problems, because the new law, new code on elections will be not able to be implemented this time. So I'm afraid that they will try to hold elections under the former law, and the decentralization will be not ended. So it means that we will have elections like in 2015, if we will have them.
Andrian, I want to bring you into the discussion. I think we haven't gotten any questions directly to you, but I got one here about impacts on Ukraine's social fabric, the destruction of norms. And I'm curious in particular, given that it's less than half a generation ago that Ukrainians experienced both the impact on norms of the rapacious corruption of the Yanukovych period, but then also the violence that went with Maidan and everything afterwards. Is the base case for Ukrainian society going to be to say we need to reset, that there's going to be a kind of rejection of whatever have become the new norms, or has the sort of social fabric settled enough now in the view of Ukrainians that they can get through a crisis like this?
Well, I think the crucial is how long the crisis will last. Most probably that by the end of April, we will have the end of the quarantine, and after that we will have renew of the economy. But still, under our focus that we did in Ukraine for the future, so we consider that by the end of spring, 4.5% of employees may lose their jobs, and that's the big risk. That in the case people losing their jobs, and in the case if economy is falling, that is a risk for worsening situation with crimes. I think the crucial thing is how long the crisis lasts, how deep it will be, and how people and economies suffer. And for me, in this case, the crucial indicators decrease in demand for electricity. So if 1.5 weeks that was 5%, then today it is 10%. And comparing to previous crises, we have 5% of electricity demand decrease meant about 12% of economic squeezing, yeah? And 10% of electricity demand decrease is not the final point. Italy has 30%. So I mean that economic fall may be very serious, and it will depend how long all this quarantine lasts. And this actually will impact on many basic things in the country.
I had a question from Neil Messina of Rapiscan Systems about the president's closure of the state border. So first of all, how thorough is that closure? I mean, for example, I assume that energy products are still going back and forth. I assume certain basic humanitarian products. For example, Ilana, you mentioned, and you're not the only one, many people have talked about how Ukraine's agriculture sector is going to be such a big beneficiary of this. Okay, but Ukrainians themselves are not going to eat more food than they were eating before. The stuff has to be exported. So how is the border closure working? Is it just people? Is it just affecting the services sector of the economy? Or is it going to be a broader closure? And what impacts is that going to have?
It is just people, and freight is going back and forth. Only exception is the lorries, you know, the cargo vehicles that go through Europe, because many European countries have also closed their borders. So this is the problem of moving goods. But ports and railroads is working fine.
And do you agree with Andrian's assessment based on projecting from energy usage about the level of economic decline? Because it's quite a bit higher, I think, than what the international projections are.
I don't know, it's hard to say for me right now, but the estimates that I saw range from -4 to -9% of GDP due to the crisis.
I mean, sorry,
Please.
just one point to make it clear that in the case for if we 2 months have electricity demand 5% less, that means that for these 2 months period we can have 10-15% economic fall. But in terms of 1 year, sure, it will be less. It may be like 5% of the GDP decrease compared to that what we could have.
Let's take maybe 1 or 2 more questions here, and then I'll wrap it up so we can stay within time. Victor, let me come back to you on this one. You said that the mono faction, the mono coalition has broken in the Rada, and certainly that seems to be true based on all the signals. But what does the future of the Rada look like? Will there be a coalition that involves some of the non-Sluga Narodu parties? Is Golos going to come in? Who's going to be part of governing Ukraine from the standpoint of coalition building, either still during the crisis or, let's say, in the immediate aftermath of it?
So my forecast is that the parliament will look very much like as it was under Poroshenko, because Poroshenko didn't have a coalition. So he has just formally, and in reality, he didn't have. So it means that under each voting, they should collect votes from different parties, fractions, and other places. So, but in this, I think it will not work long. So it can take place in several times, but later I'm afraid that Zelensky will lose the parliament, and he will try to get the new parliamentary elections after the July, because the parliament is protected for 1 year after the election. So I think he will try to do that, but I would predict that he will fail. So he is going to permanent crisis of his political power.
I don't want to steal the thunder from my colleagues who will speak about this on Tuesday next week, but information and disinformation have been a huge dimension of this crisis worldwide. But of course, we talk about information wars and disinformation. Ukraine and its ongoing war with Russia is a hotbed of that, is an absolute centerpiece, and in particular on the problem of disinformation. What impact has information either getting to the Ukrainian people or not getting to the Ukrainian people, or false information, disinformation? What impact has that had on these indicators of confidence and willingness to comply with government orders and general social cohesion?
So if to take Ukraine, I didn't notice some special new waves of disinformation or some operations, so nothing special actually happened. So yeah, I know that they do something in US and in European Union, but in Ukraine, you see the problem is that the cousin of Putin, Mr. Medvedchuk, he owns all the biggest news channels in Ukraine. So if to look at this from this point, so we have like the permanent disinformation campaign from Russians. So they don't do some special steps, I think. And but the polls actually and the figures I read in the first speech shows that actually people support the steps of the government. But I think that people do that because they really consider COVID as a threat. And from this point of view, I would say that this compliance is more of society conscience than of some special information campaigns.
It's almost like herd immunity towards disinformation. The Ukrainians have been exposed to it before, so they now have. Okay, let me give anyone who wants an opportunity for just a final thought in 30 seconds before we close. Ilona?
Yes, my final thought would be that right now I would say that the Ukrainian government response is asymmetric. So it puts most of the cost of the quarantine on people, while on its side, the parliament didn't even adopt this anti-Kolomoisky law. It was adopted only in the first reading. My opinion as a citizen is that the government is not being fair to people by putting all the cost on the population and business.
Okay, Andrian.
Yeah, I think that the next week will demonstrate the future of this COVID in Ukraine. So, because during the last 3 days we didn't have a serious increments, like the number of disease cases was the same, and a number of tests is 4 times higher than the number of cases registered. So, and in the case if we have the same dynamic, I think then we can have a hope about finishing the quarantine by the end of April.
Okay, Misha.
Well, from all it looks, there is a certain controversy or discrepancy in the response of Ukrainians. Polls show that there is a certain trust to government and to policy of quarantine. There's a big number of people, majority of people who look at the quarantine measures with understanding. But when you look at the behavior, at the practice of Ukrainians, you see there's a big distrust to the central government, certain distrust to the local governments, and reliance on neighbors, friends, and the colleagues. So I think what Ukrainians do look is to survive by working together in many different ways.
Victor, final word to you.
You should not treat the mistakes and failures of government and power as risks to Ukraine. This is my key message, because society itself is much stronger than the authorities. So you will see a lot of fails then, but don't treat this as a signs of a fail state, because society will solve almost all the problems we have.
Well, I have to say, after listening to all of you, I'm really now preoccupied. My mind is turning over and over this metaphor of the ways in which all of the threats and challenges, including disinformation, including the failure of governance, including political fractiousness, economic challenges, they're all kind of like a virus in the sense that Ukraine has endured all of them for so long that in a way, this point that both Misha and Victor have made about the resiliency of Ukrainian society, it is a special kind of immunity would be the wrong word, and I don't want to take the metaphor too far, but I'm hearing in a sense that Ukraine actually has a deep well of resiliency in its society, and that's very encouraging. So it's fitting at a time when we're all nervous and isolated physically to end on that kind of optimistic note. And I want to thank all four of our speakers very much, and thank my colleagues at the Wilson Center for making this meeting possible, and thank all of you for joining us and for your excellent questions. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.